Thanks for coming this afternoon. Lots of people attending. Hopefully some of you attended the first webinar, because I'm going to try and focus on not going across any of the old content from the last webinar in any detail at all. I'm actually going to spare you slides entirely in this presentation, not a single slide, and basically try and concentrate on giving you the most information rather than talking about myself for a while. Okay, so where we left off last time was we spent a lot of time talking about this top activity page, so I won't go over it in any detail, but we had the average number of active sessions on the y-axis and this timeline on the x-axis. And at the start of this presentation in particular, I'd like to focus on the x-axis, on the time window. So you remember what I said was one of the great things about the top activity page and active session history data is that it allows us to look back over periods of time. So I have this slidable 5-minute bar on the top activity page, which allows me to go back and look at the ASH data. Yeah, brilliant. It's going to start playing up. Let's see if I can do that again. Let me try that again. Okay, great stuff. So I can slide this fixed 5-minute grey area over the x-axis. So I can go and look back at what was happening at around about 3:27 p.m. And the great thing about ASH is, subject to you having a diagnostics pack license, of course, is because it's always enabled across all 10G and 11G databases, and you don't need to switch it on in advance. I know that I can go and look at a performance problem which happened sometime in the past, and that the data is going to be there. So I can move this around. It's a fixed 5-minute time window, and we looked at a fair amount of that last time. Okay. However, what happens if we want to look back more than around an hour, because this x-axis only covers about an hour's worth of data, okay? And yeah, it's great that we can say, oh look, I can go and look at performance problems which happened recently, even though I didn't have anything enabled. But if I can only go and look back at an hour, then it's obviously pretty limited, because many of the time you'll find out a problem the next morning in a batch load process or that kind of thing. So from the start, the top activity page always had the historical option in this refresh drop-down over here, okay? And that allows me to go back and look over longer periods of time. Now, you can immediately see that the graph looks a little bit strange, so that's kind of one indication that the historic view is actually really quite different to the near-time view. So I suppose the things that I would focus on most in terms of what's different when you're looking at historical data is, one, that when you're looking at the near-time data, the last hour, you're looking at data that's come out of in-memory buffers, so active session history memory buffers. But now, when you're looking at the historical view, you're looking at ASH data, which is stored in your AWR repository. So this is exposed via the DBA active SES history view. But it's essentially the same kind of ASH data, but it's now persisted in the database rather than being read from memory. Now, because Oracle's potentially going to keep this data for a long time, there's another, and this is possibly the most important difference for you to be aware of, is that as Oracle is saving the in-memory ASH into AWR and persisting it inside your database, it selects only 1 in every 10 of the samples. So what happens is, where the data we were looking at in the near-term view was based on 1-second samples, and I talked a little bit about what sampling data means. It means essentially you're not looking at the whole data, you're looking at a representation of the data based on sampling. Now, when you move into the stuff which is stored in AWR, then because you only have 1 in every 10 samples, you're actually looking at data with a sample rate of once every 10 seconds. So clearly, the granularity is a lot lower, and you need to treat it, obviously, with a bit more caution. So any event which started and ended within 10 seconds within the ASH sample period wouldn't be captured at all here. But in terms of how far you can go and look back at serious performance problems that went over a long time, it's still a useful tool. You just need to be a little bit cautious. The other thing you'll see is that this fixed grey bar has now changed from a 5-minute period to a 30-minute period. Now that, if you think about it, is a reasonably sensible thing to do, because if we're looking at data with a lower level of granularity, we probably want to look at more of it over a longer period of time for that data to really make any sense when we're looking at these drill downs along the bottom down here. So there are limitations to it, and the important thing, and this is true whenever we're using any performance analysis tool, is to be aware of the limitations of the tool. But the great thing about this is, because it's being persisted in AWR, then Oracle's going to keep it around for as long as your AWR retention period. So subject to you allocating some space and a configuration of AWR retention and that diagnostics pack license, this stuff could go back a year, however far you want it to go, essentially, or sensibly based on your space requirements. Now, if you stop and think about that, what that means that, let's say in a situation where I have an AWR retention period of 42 days, then I can go back and look at session-specific, SQL-specific, module-specific information, so I can drill down to a really sensible scope, and I can do that over my entire AWR period. So it's an incredibly powerful tool. Now, in addition to maybe being able to troubleshoot some serious problems which have happened more than an hour ago or a few days ago, and despite the fact it may have its limitations, I've been able to do that lots of times over the years. Having this historic ASH data has always allowed you to be able to have a good view of your system over your AWR retention period. So you can see things like the kind of weekly and daily and monthly cycles you get on your system. And you start to get a good feel for what the workload's like. Okay? So this has always been available to us, but it's maybe been of limited use. Okay? So instead of just using it for troubleshooting or going back and looking at a rough picture of how our system behaves, how about if we were able to do some really detailed analysis over large periods of ASH data? And essentially, what OEM 12c has introduced is a feature called ASH Analytics, which allows us to use all this historic ASH data that we've got sitting around in the sysops table space to go out and work out useful information about the workload usage of a particular database instance we're looking at. Okay. So this is OEM 12c. You'll see under the performance menu bar, you'll see this ASH Analytics option. Now, a couple of important things that I should highlight before is that you might not be able to see this ASH Analytics option, and there's a couple of reasons why you might not. One is more obvious, one's a little bit more subtle. The first thing is that in order to see the ASH Analytics option at all, you need to install some additional PL SQL inside the target instance which supports ASH Analytics. Now, OEM will warn you when you try and when you add the instance, but you maybe need some DBA help with running this because you need some elevated privileges. So the first time when we used this at a customer site, I realized that we didn't have these packages installed, and I had to go and ask one of our friendly DBAs, and he helped me out and installed them. So that's one reason why you might not see ASH Analytics at all. Another one which caught me out for a little bit longer was the first time I used this on a customer site, as opposed to on my laptop here, was on an Exadata system. Now, because Exadata's, because it was a rack system, it was a cluster, I was looking at cluster-wide performance views and found that I couldn't see this ASH Analytics option on the menu. However, if I drill down to a specific instance, then I can. Now, I'm not sure whether that's changed or whether that's going to change soon, but my experience to date on the first version of OEM 12c is that if you want to use it on rack, you need to drill down to a specific instance. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of reasons, because for a while, I must admit, it confused me because I'd been doing all this stuff at home and I'd seen demos Open World and on the Oracle website, and then we installed it and I can see ASH Analytics. And the reason was because it was looking cluster-wide. So if you don't see it, that's a couple of reasons why you might not see it. Okay. But once it's installed, we just click this ASH Analytics option here, and we'll go and see what this gives us. So I would suggest that at first sight, it should look pretty familiar, right? For anybody who's familiar with the top activity page, this is a pretty familiar picture we've got here. And we've got this average active sessions graph of the kind you see on the top activity page. And we've also got the SQL drill downs here with the top SQL statements, and the session drill down here with the top session activity as well. We can also see we've got some weight classes along here. So all of this should be really familiar for anybody who's used top activity before or saw the previous webinar. Okay. However, there's a few differences, and one difference in particular is this panel on the top. So I can see that I've still got a 5-minute window here, and I'm still looking at the past hour, right? So again, a little bit similar to top activity page, and I can slide the 5-minute activity window around, and it'll update the active sessions chart below. However, one of the questions that I was always asking, and that certainly lots of people always ask me, was is the 5-minute window fixed. Okay, so the 5-minute window has always been fixed on the top activity page, and in Ash Analytics it's not, so I can resize it. So if I want to go and look at, say, something like more like a 20-minute period, then I can resize this activity window here, and this thing's crawling a bit. I'm just wondering. Let me just see. Okay, so I can resize this window here, and all the time that I'm resizing it, the activity period I'm looking at, so this is the range of Ash data I'm looking at, this activity chart changes, and so do the drill downs down here. So immediately, just a nice to have thing is we're not fixed with a 5-minute window anymore, which, as I'm sure lots of you have used this a lot, will appreciate can be quite useful, because sometimes you just want to look over a 20-minute period or something, and all that faffing around moving the 5-minute window bar around was just a little bit annoying. Okay. But the other thing is we have this range of buttons up here, and so I can change this window. So instead of looking at the past hour as the top activity page does, I'll select the past day. Now, as I select different periods of time, one, the period of time that I can select from changes along here, along the x-axis. So I'm now looking at the past day's worth of activity. And two, the size of this activity bar changes as well, and in quite a sensible way, I think. It's another one of the really nice little design details that I really appreciate from the people who work on this stuff. Because as I select day, this activity window changes into an hour period, because that's probably a sensible granularity to be looking at a day's worth of data, right? As I switch to week, it's going to change it to a day-wide window. So hopefully that makes sense. I can go and select these different periods. The default size of the activity window changes, but clearly, as well as being able to move it around, which we've talked about, I can also still resize it. So if I wanted to, I can go and look at this, what's that, about 3 or 4 hour period. So I can then go for month. So what I thought might be useful for this webinar is, how about if we looked at the swing bench benchmarks that I was running at the last last webinar a couple of weeks ago. So I switched to the month view, and I can see I've got like the 16th of July here, the 9th of July, the 2nd of July. So I can move this window over here now. Oh, and now this is a week's worth of data. So when I'm analyzing the month view, by default it highlights a week's worth of data. Again, to me seems a sensible granularity, because this is an analytics tool, remember. It's more than a troubleshooting tool. So I can move this grey activity window over to when I was doing the webinar, and I'll resize it a little bit as well. And I can see some activity here. So I could keep faffing around a little bit with this window and keep resizing it and pull it up and try and highlight the particular period of activity I'm looking at. Okay, so I can mess around with this. I can move it over a little bit and say I'm more interested in that activity. And all the time as I'm doing this, here's the important thing. It's not just a bunch of pretty pictures, right? What's happening is, as I move that grey bar around and I resize it, what I'm doing is I'm changing a range of data that I look at. So I'm changing my analysis period. And I hope you'll agree that basically by being able to look back over weeks or months, or one of the problems from the laptop is that I haven't had this system running for months with the long AWR retention. But you could potentially have a year's worth of AWR and be looking, I mean, it would be kind of crazy thing to do a little bit, but you can select max, and if you've got a long AWR retention, you've got a lot of Ash data to play with. Okay. So hopefully, at the very least, I've highlighted here that it's very easy and very powerful in terms of you being able to define the particular period of time that you want to look at and to analyze and to see what's going on. Okay. However, that's not where it all stops, all right? So we have a bit more flexibility in the period we're looking at, but we also have a lot more flexibility in the way we're going to analyze the data as well. And that happens, oops, sorry, slip of the fingers there. I should mention quite a few people commented last time on the fact that I managed to get this to run reasonably efficiently on my laptop, along with the database and the swing bench tests. My laptop is running a little slow today, so it does happen. But hopefully it'll be okay. Okay. So, great. We can select different periods of time And what's happening all the time is the activity graph is changing, and so is the familiar, hopefully from the last presentation, SQL drill down panel and session drill down panel down here. And of course, just like the top activity page, as I flick over the different activity classes over here, they'll be highlighted in the graph so I can see which is more important. And equally, familiar stuff, I can see there's sort of around 12 average active sessions here. And look, it looks like commit is quite a big part of this, along with CPU and some system IO. Okay, so far so good. However, we can actually drill down into more dimensions in Ash Analytics as well. So whereas over here in the past, you could select from things like module, session ID, object, file, that kind of thing. Now when you select how you want to drill down into the drill down area, you have a lot more flexibility here. And a lot of it's been very well designed to give you the most sensible options easily available to you. So if I click on this drop down and go to top dimensions, I can see that Oracle have given me a selection of the dimensions I'm perhaps most likely to want to look at. Things like weight class, which is what I'll select first. So if I select weight class, you'll now see that as well as weight classes being what's driving the active sessions chart, it's now also driving the drill down here. So, but maybe I want to go to something like specific weight events instead. And I can now see that we have, well, CPU is the most common type of activity over this period, log file sync, then direct path read, SQL net break, reset to client, that kind of thing. However, that's just on this drill down here, and what I'll probably do, in fact, is I'll just change that back to user session. So I'll change that back to user session, but I can also change how the average active sessions graph is shown. So again, you're used to seeing weight classes, but I might say, well, I want to see weight events instead so that I'm not grouping them up so much. And as usual, sensibly, and they order them from bottom to top in terms of most active with the CPU and the CPU stuff at the bottom. So I can see that log file sync is a really big part of this activity, direct path read. And then as we get towards the top, we have things which are less significant in the contribution to the activity. And all the time, remember, that I could have picked any period over my entire AWR retention period of any width and any time, right? So it's immediately pretty useful. Okay? I could also say, well, let's leave that one on weight event a moment. Let's say down here I wanted to select something like, I'll select module. Okay? So if you have an application which is well instrumented using DBMS application info, and fortunately enough, I've been fortunate enough to work at a site where the applications are pretty well instrumented, I can now go and see that essentially over this period of time, the new order module was the most active, okay? And I can see that that was responsible for a lot of the log file sync, CPU, some DB files, sequential read, that kind of thing. Again, though, I can do this at this level. I can do it on the active sessions chart, so I can switch the module up here. Okay, and I can now see that. Now, some of my activity isn't going to be instrumented, and some of it might be instrumented with this others. Let me try and explain what's going on. So, overall activity, let me just take this back to the start again. I'm just going to back up just a tiny bit. Okay, so this is my overall activity organized by weight class. If I switch to something like module, you'll see that there's a black line above the colored areas. So the sum of the Ash data doesn't have module set. So what Ash Analytics does is, this black line shows you the overall activity or total activity. So if I deselect that, I won't see that anymore. And the colored areas show me the individual modules which are actually instrumented. But as you can see, I can immediately start to flick through these either on the chart or on the key over here, and I can see which are the most significant contributors, right? So I might say, well, this new order guy looks interesting. I want to see some more information about what this new order part of this new order module of my application was actually doing. And if I click on new order, what you'll see over here is I've now had a filter applied. So there's a filter over here which says that all the data I'm looking at now, as well as being over this period of time, is limited, so I'm only looking at what new order was responsible for, its contribution. And you can see more clearly now that there's this black overall activity line, but the new order part of that activity is this here, and this is how much it contributes to it. We can also see the SQL statements associated with that new order module, okay, and only that new order module, and which contribution they made. So I can now see that new order was contributing quite a bit to our activity. I can see that most of its activity was commit and CPU, and I can see that the majority of the activity came from the SQL statement commit. Well, it's actually the PL SQL block itself, so it's the PL SQL new order module. But maybe I can go down to here, so I've got insert into order items and that kind of thing. So what I've been able to do now is not only look at the period of time I want, but to drill into individual module. Maybe within that individual module, what I want to do is say that I'm interested in a specific SQL ID. So I could change this to SQL ID on the active sessions chart. And bear in mind that we've constantly got this new order filter applied. So I'm only looking at the specific part of my application I care about. And I can now see the most active SQL statements and flick over them and see which ones contributed the most. Now, all the time, I need to keep emphasizing, this is not about pretty pictures, right? This is about having a performance profile of your application activity profile, I should say, which shows you what's the most important contributors to DB time. So which are the most active things in the database. So I'm looking at the module that I decided was interested in, a period I was interested in, and now I can see, well, this SQL statement's the key one that would appear to me. And again, probably a bad example in retrospect, but it's the PL SQL block itself, and it's the commit class which is responsible for a lot of this stuff. Hopefully everything's okay so far. I should double check if there's any questions. Wow, there's a lot of questions. Maybe I'll go back to the demo. Okay. Now, when I've got these filters set up, if at any time I want to, sorry, what I should say is I can obviously move the window around still, and I'm still filtering on new order, but because new order wasn't running during this time, there's no data. So I can also see at what points in time a specific module was running by setting this filter and then moving the window about. So I can see that it executed for a little bit over here, right? So there was a little bump of new order activity there. Not so much, but a little bit. So essentially, it becomes an analytics tool, very much like a BI analytics in a way, in the sense that it's actually finally using all the dimensions of the ASH data, allowing you to change your analysis period and allowing you to drill into it in different ways. Anytime I want to back up and say, well, I'm interested in looking at the whole picture now, not new order, I can just delete the filter. And what will happen is that I'll start to see the data for everything, not just the new order. But you can see here, I've still got SQL IDs because that's what the average active sessions chart is set up for. There's all kinds of dimensions up here. I could decide that I wanted to look at, I don't know, a specific action. Okay, so if I select action on there, what will happen when my laptop kicks into gear a bit is I can see, well, actually, login is quite a big part of this activity, followed by get customer details, get product details by category. Let's say I want to look at get customer details, for example. So I click on get customer details, a filter is applied, and now everything I'm looking at is just for that get customer details action. So we're drilling down into the action level now, and I can see that most of the activity is CPU, and most of it comes from the SQL statement. So I can see that SQL statement there, and I can, the important thing here is I can decide that, well, if for some reason I felt that get customer details was using more resource than it should, then I kind of know where to focus my efforts, right? Because I'm not going to focus a lot of attention on tuning these guys when this guy's responsible for so much to the activity. So it's kind of OEM ASH traditional stuff, right? You're looking at the big hitters. It's kind of like the click on the big stuff that I mentioned last time. Okay, so there's lots of different dimensions we can drill through, right? Hopefully you have a sense of the flexibility. If I just flick over some of these options, there's most of the things that you want to be able to analyze. And maybe in the past you would actually have to write your own SQL scripts against ASH data, and lots of people are very good at doing this. And I want to say people who've done a lot of this kind of work. But what this does is, like true analytics, if you think, instead of having to kind of write a script for every particular problem you're trying to solve, you've got this really interactive environment where you can really ask questions about what the hell is going on with my system and over particular periods of time. However, it doesn't stop there, because all of this is still really traditional top activity style representation of the information, because we've still got the active sessions graph. But we can take a different way of viewing things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to back up to weight class, and this is what we would see as the traditional average active sessions chart. And let's move the window around again and resize it a little bit. Okay, so although, as I say, it's a little slow today, but it's predominantly because of my laptop. But frankly, for those of you who've used very early versions of OEM, I actually think this is fairly slick, particularly when I use it on decent hardware. Okay, so I can click Load Map. Now, Load Map is new to 12c. There were some signs of it coming along in earlier versions of OEM with the database load map that you would get on the front page, but it's used pretty extensively in OEM 12c. Now, this kind of view of data might be familiar to those of you who are old enough, like me, to remember those utilities that you used to get, which showed you where the disk space was being used on your PC, okay? So you would see, like, this directory is using this much space, and there's a couple of files over here using this much space, just in terms of being able to know where the hell all your space was going on the disk. And I think the reason that a load map, it's not a load map, but this map kind of view, a tree map, I think I've heard them referred to as well, and there's probably somebody who knows this stuff better than me who could correct me. The reason why it's so good for showing things like where disk space is being used on a hard disk is because it's a really good way of representing lots of information in a very quick and easy to understand way. Because essentially what it's doing is it's taking the information and it's putting the most important and the most significant areas on the top left of the picture and using bigger squares to show the contribution. So it's using squares, colored squares, and by the area you can tell how big a deal this is, because the area is dictated by how active this is. And so we can see that if we look at the top line, these are the different weight classes, okay? So user I/O, if you look at its overall square, it's just bigger than the CPU square. So user I/O is the most significant contributor here. However, inside user I/O, we also have going from top left to bottom right. Direct path read is the most significant, followed by some DB file parallel read, some DB file sequential read, and then getting down towards read by other session, DB file scattered read, direct path write temp. Do I even really want to be looking down here? Are these really the focus of my attention? But then also the squares themselves going top left to bottom right, the least significant information is down here. So user I/O and CPU are a big deal. Commit we've seen frequently as a big deal. And this SQLnet break reset to client looks like a bit of a pain as well. But down here, when we get into the system I/O, we've got some log file parallel, right, etc., etc., etc. We have a tiny amount of concurrency weights, which probably isn't surprising because I'm running some benchmarks on a laptop. But you can see that when we start to get down to this kind of area, maybe we don't, and I maybe shouldn't say this, maybe we don't care. So like all performance analysis tools, what this is really doing effectively is it's showing me what to concentrate on. And the load map view, I think, is a really good way of doing this. Now, just like the drill downs and the average active sessions graph, sorry, I'm just seeing somebody saying there's some audio cut out, so I'll try and not move the CPU slider around so much. Again, Oracle have picked some nice combinations of what you might want to look at in a load map. So here we've got weight class and weight event. Maybe I'd be more interested in module and action, which is something we've looked at if our application is instrumented. So now I can see that over this period of time, the writing's a little bit small, but the most active thing was actually OEM, it turns out. And inside OEM, because it's instrumented, these are the various actions inside OEM which are responsible for the activity. Second most active module was new order, which we've seen, and login, get product details by category, slowly going down. So you can see that the human eye is kind of drawn to the top left of something, or at least my human eye is anyway. So I can kind of focus on, wow, this is the important stuff, but it's still capturing everything down here, and it's kind of trying to record it in little boxes, even though this is probably not the stuff that we're most interested in, right? However, this is only actually a simple load map. Oh, sorry, something I should have mentioned here. If I click on Get Product Details by Category, I now get a filter on it. So again, all of the stuff that was available in the previous option, in the active sessions graph, are available here. Now clearly that's a bit of a stupid filter to pick because everything's Get Product Details by Category. But if I was to, so I delete that filter. Hold on, is it doing its thing? Yeah. If I delete that filter, maybe I select New Order instead, I now just see the new order activity, and I can see that login's the most important Get Product Details by Category. Again, maybe not stellar examples, but giving you a hint of the kind of flexibility that you've got. More to the point, these are just simple load maps. And again, if I make the filter go away, then it goes back to module and action. These are just simple load maps. We can also move on to, and in a lot of cases, simple load maps are going to be what you want, right? They have some fairly sensible options on here. Weight class and SQL ID. So user I/O was significant. Which SQL statements were the significant ones for user I/O? Which SQL statements were the significant ones for CPU, and so on. But you can also click to this more advanced view. And what the advanced view allows you to do is to configure more precisely what you want out of the load map. So one of the things I can do is I can flick this over to 3D, and I'm now going to be able to select 3 different dimensions that I want to look at the data over. So maybe I want to do something like, I mean, there's one here, weight class, weight event, and SQL ID. Okay, so we can see this is the user I/O box. Inside user I/O, direct path reads, the most important. DB file parallel reads, next more important. And inside DB file parallel read, these are the SQL statements responsible for it, and so on, down to stuff which maybe we shouldn't be worrying about so much. However, we can change all of these, so I could decide that I want to pick something like session identifier, session attributes. So I could decide I want to pick, what I'll do is I'll pick program, and then I'm going to pick module and action. So, hold on, bear with me. Okay. And I'll pick action over here. Or to be honest, you might be happy with that view with the SQL ID. But the point is that you have the flexibility to do which of these you want. So I now have this 3D view where I can see that now I'm looking at the entirety of the JDBC thin client, which is what Swingbench is running. Actually, the benchmarks were bigger users than the OMS, than OEM. So within the JDBC thin client, I can then see the most active module, and then inside those, the most active actions. So he said, looking at his time and thinking about a bit of Q&A. And let me just see if there was anything else I wanted to cover. You know, I'm not sure there is. It occurred to me that if, having shown you all of this stuff, you don't think it's really exciting, and you can't think of ways that you would be able to use this on your applications to come up with sensible answers to questions that people ask about what your applications are doing, then I probably can't make you excited. Because I think the tool itself was just that exciting when I first used it. It's kind of answered a lot of the questions that I previously had of OEM in terms of I wish I could do this and I wish I could do that. You know, I wish I could change the size of the window. I wish I could drill through more dimensions and look at more detailed view. And to kind of finish, hopefully on a funny note, people who I work with beside at client sites would tell you that there is kind of a slight danger with me that I'll never write scripts again, and I'm just making fun of myself, right? I'm not going to be a pictures guy forever. But the main reason why I would end up still writing scripts against Ash, well, a couple of reasons. One is to kind of look at more detailed information for troubleshooting. But the other one was to aggregate up information in this way. And frankly, I don't think any scripts I write are going to get close to being as flexible as this and be able to let me do my job as quickly. So not to put too fine a point on it, I just think this stuff is amazing. I just think it rocks. And so I might just leave it there if that's okay, James, because if there's questions or if people want me to show you different things, this might be an opportunity to do it, because when I last did this presentation on a boat off Norway, somebody in the audience told me afterwards that they kept wanting to go, no, 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 click over there, show me this bit. So if anybody wants me to click in a certain place, just speak up. Other than that, I think I'll open it to Q&A if that's okay, James.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you, Doug. And yeah, I too think this is absolutely fascinating. It's fantastic. So thank you again, and with some feedback that has already come in to say just how exciting people are, and people can't wait to use that. So that's really nice. Thank you for leaving your feedback as well as questions, and I hope everybody else is excited as we are about this. So there are a few questions, so I'm going to go through those. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to run another session in a couple of weeks. I'll tell you exactly when now. Sorry, I should know this off by heart as I actually arranged it. But let me just quickly look. So there's a session on the 15th of August. So the next webinar is by Randolph Geist. That's on Oracle Cost Base Optimizer. But then Doug will be running a session on the 15th of August. Please do sign up for that. He's going to highlight some questions that have come from both of the webinars that he's presented and explain the answers, or go into a little more detail about the answers. So that's going to be fantastic. But as Doug said, now's a great opportunity. We have the screen in front of us. So if there's areas that you would like to explore in a little bit more detail, then please type this in the question panel now. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the top. So I think, Doug, you also have this window. So
yeah,
you know whether some of these questions have actually already been answered. So the first question from Abdul Mohammed, he's asking about the historical data pulled out of the AWR repository, and does 12c have something which will help us retain AWR data longer than what the target AWR retention is set to?
Yeah, I understand the question. Not to my knowledge, but what I'll do is I'll make a note of the question, because I know some people who might be able to answer that. But to my knowledge, it's at the moment it would only look at data in your AWR repository.
Fantastic, thank you. So the next question from Richard Kinreid. Thank you, Richard. So he's saying that they've started looking at upgrading from 10.2 to 11G R2. How does OEM 12c fit in? We're already licensed for OEM on 11G.
So we're talking about upgrading 10.2 databases to 11GR2 databases, hopefully. And how does OEM 12c in terms of talking to those targets and in terms of licensing? Hopefully I've got the question right. I'm working at a site where they're rolling out some 12c at the moment, and my personal experience of this, because I'm not from OEM development, I'm just a user, right? Is that essentially it's perfectly able to talk to 10G and 11G targets, and your licensing model shouldn't change at all. So we're going for a straight from, I think it's like 10.205 grid control up to 12C, and plug in the same targets in that we had on the previous version. Hopefully that answers the question, but if not, maybe you can chat.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, that seems sensible. The next question from Luis Ramirez. Thank you, Luis. He's asking just what was the name of the PL SQL packages needed to see Ash Analytics?
I'm laughing because I can't remember, but I know that Kellen, who's on the webinar, will be able to remember the name. So if Kellen wants to chat the name, she can probably remember. I can't.
Fantastic. Kellen has actually has already asked a question, and she will be presenting a webinar in a related topic. But please, Kellen, if you know that answer, please stick it in the question on the chat box.
I mean, I could look it up, but.
So next question from Suman Kumar, and he would like to know, I guess you might have mentioned this in the first webinar, but can Ash Analytics be added on a previous version, so something other than OEM 12c?
I think for a change I can answer that as a no. Okay. Again, I believe that Kellen might have tried that, but my understanding is that you need to be using OEM 12c, end of story.
Thank you. So it's some quite detailed questions here, so apologies for the delay in actually...
The Abdul question, which is next, he might want to drop me a mail, because I have had problems with VMware myself, but it's not a thing I want to spend a lot of time talking about just now, if that's okay.
Okay, so at the end of the session, I will leave Doug's Twitter handle, so please, Abdul, if you want to get in contact with Doug there, or via his blog, and talk about things that are slightly off topic, for example, like VMware. So Richard,
no idea about them.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go on.
So Richard Kinridge is asking, at the last session, a load simulator tool was mentioned. When I went to the site, there were multiple warnings about potential viruses. I think this is something that we spoke a little bit about in the last webinar, and I think, Doug, you found out this has been fixed. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think people who attended the last webinar reported it to Dominic Gell, so thanks very much for that. And he blogged about it a few days later, saying that he cleared up the issue for now and that he checked it on Google and it looked okay. So my understanding of it, and I blogged about this a couple of days later, my understanding of it is that as of now that problem's been resolved.
Great. Could you just remind the audience of the tool, please?
It's called Swing Bench, and it's by a guy called Dominic Giles.
Fantastic, thank you. So Samson Gadikar, thank you, Samson. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's asking, does color have any significance? So, e.g., the log file parallel write is in red. Is this a concern?
I could give you some funny answers, probably not what you're looking for, but there's a lot of discussion in my current client about how appropriate the color brown is for some things. Giving you a more sensible answer, one of the things that OEM does is it frequently changes color mappings as you go between screens, particularly on previous versions of OEM, not always in completely predictable and understandable ways. So I wouldn't read anything into the colors in particular. They are designed for you to be able to be good to look at and to interpret, but just because something is red in color doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, no.
Okay. Thank you, Doug. So Kellen's helped us out here, so I just want to go back to the original questions. So the original question, one of them was from Lewis, and it's what is the name of the PL SQL packages needed to see Ash Analytics? Thank you, Kellen, for answering this, and it's the Ash Viewer package. And then also, to use Ash Analytics, you must be using OEM 12c. So thank you again, Kellen, for helping us out. So a question here from Juan Trujillo. Hope I pronounced that okay. He's asking, I want to analyze a rack system as a whole system or all instances. Is it possible to use the Ash Analytics function on 12c to do this?
Not that I am aware of, but I'll confess that this might be something which is a moving target. I haven't discussed it with the guys in development. All I know is when I used it on Exadata, I couldn't. So I can only tell you that my personal experience is I haven't been able to do that. I would be really surprised if something didn't appear in future.
Thank you, Doug. A quick question here from John Thomas. Thank you, John. He's asking about, are there any browser restrictions that you know of?
If there's one area that I think they've really, there may be some, but I haven't come across them yet. And if there's one area that I give the OEM a lot of credit for working on and a lot of criticism for in the past, to be balanced, is that a lot of the old browser annoyances, which I got used to, seem to have gone. This new user interface is, to me, is much slicker and also seems to be more compatible with a wider range of browsers. And you don't get that strange behavior depending on what browser you're using, not in the same way. There may be browser restrictions, but all I can talk is about the browsers I use, and it's been great.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question here from Eric Fall, and he's asking, do you know if there's a way to...
I think that's similar to a question that was asked earlier, actually, a little bit. Pretty similar to what was asked earlier, which is, if can you look at not just a target database and look at its AWR repository, but look at your own AWR repository that you've got somewhere else. And the reference to DBID is you can move AWR data into different databases, and for example, run an AWR differences report using different DBIDs. And the honest answer is that I can't say be categorical you can't do it, but I'm pretty sure you can't at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Next question from BJ Mahawa. Thank you, BJ. So like in OEM 12g, does 12c offer advisor and alert in case of breach of baseline metrics?
Yeah, all the adaptive threshold stuff carries on as before, although it's not a thing I've used a lot, but yes, it does.
So a question that's related to to browsers kind of. So this is about operating systems, and this does 12c support 64-bit Linux?
Does it only support 64-bit Linux? I think the question. Honestly, I have no idea. I don't know everything about all the different versions OEM supports. That sort of information is much better answered by going to my Oracle support and checking compatibility matrices and stuff like that. I wouldn't want to be saying things like that.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Another short question here from Sue Schiffer. Thank you, Sue. Does OEM support Visual SQL tuning diagrams?
Of the old style or something different? I mean, it supports it still has Visual SQL plan views, but I'm not sure whether that's what Sue's asking about really. If she means what was, sorry, he or she means what was supported on previous versions, then yeah, sure. If you mean something new, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thank you, Doug. Okay, so the next question comes from Michael McFall. Thank you, Michael. And so he's asking, in your experience, Doug, are many of your customers, clients, using 12c to provision Oracle databases and binaries?
Yeah, it's a great question. No, not in my experience. I mean, I'm sure some OEM product managers would want to give me a kicking for saying it, but I just find that DBAs in the main, there's a whole process around patching that just kind of encourage continuing manual intervention, to be honest with you. I know Oracle make a big deal of this, but in my personal experience, I don't know lots of people who use the provisioning stuff in the way that they would hope to. That's just my honest answer.
Thank you, Doug. There's a few comments actually that have come in around operating systems, and that was Windows, Linux 3264, AIX, and Solaris. But
I have no idea.
I think Doug's advice on actually looking at the Oracle documentation is good advice, so please check that out. So Bernard Wislock, thank you, Bernard. And Bernard's asking if Ash Analytics is not available for the whole cluster, but only for single instances within the cluster, how can one use it for monitoring queries with inter-instance parallelism? Under which instance can you find the data?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. It's still a thing that I would need to do more work on myself. It's an excellent question, but I honestly don't know the answer.
Great. So it's likely, Ben, and anybody else that's listening, this is could be one of the questions. I'm not going to say it definitely, but it could be one of the questions that Doug may look at on the 15th of August. So again, please sign up for that webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I noticed what Kellen was saying. You shut the patching off. Most DBAs do.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of sort of general points here, and I think these are probably things, again, we can cover in a bit more detail on the 15th of August. So I'm just going to actually open it up to Doug now to look at it as any other questions that have just been asked, whether he wants to finish off on a couple of points. So Doug, if you want to choose a couple more questions to finish off on, and then as I mentioned before, we can look at some more interesting areas and more areas that are going to help you on the session on the 15th.
I'm not sure. I've been paging through the questions as you go, and I mean, if I pick up some questions towards the end, any details on K-Splice, which I guess is part of 12c, I'm not sure what that has to do with Dash Analytics stuff, but or why it would be part of 12c, or I mean, I know what case splice is. I could talk about case splice, but I don't really get where the question's coming from, if I'm honest. I think the clients, do your clients link OEM 12c with my Oracle support and use the recommendations given? I've seen some people do that even though they haven't used the provisioning, but the problem quite often is that even though maybe people should have got past this these days, people are still a little bit funny about having the servers going out onto the net. It seems to be an option that people are more interested in looking at things like Exadata, where the patching recommendations can be quite complex, and doing, what's the damn term of it, the call home sort of thing, where you have hardware faults. But I don't really know many people who are doing that. For David Van Zandt, yeah, there'll be a video, but that's probably more a question for James.
Great.
I'm not sure, to be honest with you, James, whether there's that many more I can answer here. There's been a few which have come up after both webinars, which are kind of tucked away at the back of my mind, which I think might be useful to cover in the next presentation. Well, one of the things I was going to say is I'll probably blog about this webinar in the next sort of few days, and that'll be at oracledug.com, as you can see on the website, the presentation slide there. If I blog about the webinar, if people have detailed questions they want to ask, because I do think that some of them people need to do a bit in writing. Yeah, I know what case splice is, but okay. If people want to post comments with more detailed written questions, then maybe James and I can have a look through those and decide which ones we could base the next webinar on.
Great. Thank you, Doug. And I actually want to finish off with one question here, which I think everybody wants to know, and I'm sure Doug also wants to know, and that's when is Oracle going to release database version 12? And there have been some rumors, kind of December, January time.
I have absolutely no idea, and if I did, I couldn't possibly say it as an ACE director.
Excellent. So we'll leave that. It's kind of like an Apple scenario. I'm sure we'll find out very close to the release date. Yeah, it's certainly exciting. Thank you once again.
I'm saying nothing. Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody for attending.
Okay, so what we've got here, so we've just got the contact details for Doug and ourselves, so please do get in touch with us if you need to. You can visit Doug's website, oracledug.com. Please follow Doug on Twitter, OracleDoug. But you can connect with him about today's webinar, but also you'll be able to find out lots of information about the work that he's doing through his Twitter account. Please visit allthingsoracle.com and follow me at allthingsoracle, especially if you want to hear about more webinars when recordings are up and other educational stuff that I'm doing. And you can also get in contact with me by email, is my direct email there.